Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. My name is Tara Nash, and today I am joined by Susan Hayden. Susan is a multi genre writer living in LA, and she's currently working on a hybrid memoir. Susan has many writing accolades, but she tells me that the thing she's most proud of in her life is her son, who is a musician, Mason Summit. So, welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
It's so good to have you here. And we were introduced by a mutual friend, Chanel, and you come to grief from being very suddenly widowed at the young age of 45 years old. Your husband, Christopher Allport, died suddenly in a skiing accident, and you were left with your son, who was then 11 years old. So, like, a huge shock, a huge trauma. Yeah, perhaps you want to share more about Christopher and what happened.
Okay. Well, my then husband, Chris, he was someone who had, I would say, it's called the adrenaline gene. That's what they're calling it now. And he had the need, the urge to have constant adventure. And not everyday adventure like maybe you or I would have, but something else like that would make him feel like he was risking his life. I think there was something in him that needed to do that. And so when I met him, I was 27, and I made an agreement with myself that I loved him, and I knew, based on his past, that if I tried to stop him from his adventures, that I would be denying his own nature, and it would ruin the relationship. The relationship wouldn't last. And so I told him how I felt about it, but I also explained that I wasn't going to stop him, but that I used to say, don't take risks. And so the day that it happened where he didn't make it home, and that was in January 2008, the irony of that situation was he was going to a slope of man-made snow, which is not as much for adventurers and mountaineers. He was going with his best friend who lives across the street. And what they would do is, and what they did was, they would take the lift up and duck the rope. So they take the lift up to the regular ski slope, duck the rope, and go into the, quote, back country of the mountain, the ungroomed slopes, and ski down. He was a telemark skier, so he was a free heel skier. He would ski. That was his favorite thing. And a series of conditions, including the fact that it had rained the night before, created conditions that created a kind of I don't know what you'd call it, snow, ice, danger. It created an avalanche. It created something that it had crossed his mind in the morning that it could be risky, but he was still going to do it anyway, if that makes sense. Like, I remember him waking up and saying, oh, it rained last night. And I remember saying to him, oh, what does that mean? And he said, oh, it'll be fine. But I did find out that they were warned when they were up on the mountain. Our friend Bruce got a phone call from his partner saying, be careful, there are some missing people at Mountain High right now, and they're saying that there's avalanche danger. And Chris just said, I'm going. Like, he just ignored it and went. And they both skied down that mountain. They were about 20 feet apart. Chris went first, and he was basically buried alive. And Bruce tried to dig him out, and unsuccessfully. And the rest is history. So these two emotions sit side by side. There's on one level, this preparation, like, okay, you are with a risk taker. Something bad could happen one day. That's over here. But then there's over here, my life, my life. Our family, our 3-person family, my 11-year-old son, his older son, my stepson. It was unthinkable, but at the same time, there was a part of me that feared it could happen. And so, yes, it was a shock. And there's no way that anybody could prepare for something like this. But when I really started to process my grief, I began to realize that he had probably cheated death so many times I didn't know about. And it got him.
Wow.
And yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking while you were sharing, in grief, a lot of the time we're always ruminating, going back and thinking, I wish I'd said this. Did you have that a lot with, thinking, I wish I told him, no, don't do that, or not to go on that trip, or did you not have that so much because, like you said, you were prepared to be with this risk taker and you probably knew that you couldn't?
Yeah. I mean, I knew I couldn't stop him. Yes, I did much of that, a lot of ruminating. It was the one thing I have to say is that he and we let everything out. And so when he died, it wasn't like I thought, oh, I forgot to say this or tell him that. So in that respect, there was a kind of peacefulness about the unfinished business. It was like we had that ongoing conversation, that communication. So, but as far as stopping him, no one could stop him. He was unstoppable. So if I had said, I don't want you to go today, he wouldn't have listened to me. He wasn't someone who really listened. He just did it his way. And for better or for worse, I mean, it was his choice. He would take those chances. And I had to accept that. And like I said, there was a part of me that was thinking, oh, something could happen, but you never really know how you're going to feel when that something happens. So it wasn't like I could live in my everyday life with something could happen today, because I wouldn't have been able to ever breathe. So I filed it somewhere. I compartmentalized, and I had a kind of ironically buried understanding with myself that this was a risky person. And interestingly enough, as I was getting older, I'd been with him for 17 and a half years. I was kind of outgrowing it. I mean, I was still in love with him, but I was kind of over his not letting it be the exchange, not letting it be, well, wait, my wife is concerned about me. And that was an interesting thing that, if had he lived, the big had he lived, it would have come up. We would have been working through that, or it would have been part of the conversation, I believe.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I really appreciate what you shared, that you had a very open dialogue always with each other. So you didn't have that sort of residue of, I wish I'd said this or said that more. And, a lot of times people think, oh, I wish I'd told them how much I love them more. Or, things like that come up. For you, when you look back at that time in your life, what would you say were the biggest struggles for you in the grief?
Well, I would say that I had never had autonomy, and I didn't really know how to completely take care of myself or my son. I had been dependent on men. And before Chris, it was a relationship I was in before, and it was a prior relationship. And then it was, my father had always been there. My father passed away during early on in my relationship with Chris. But as long as my father was alive, I felt like I was protected and safe, and I had my anchor. And I never really grew up. I mean, I had a lot of my own creative adventures, but I had never really learned how to take care of myself and make those choices and be bold. And so So it was a struggle to face up to how much power I suddenly had.
Mm.
All of a sudden, I was in charge of everything, and I hadn't been in the marriage. I had a voice. I could say, I don't like this, I don't like that. But ultimately, Chris made the decisions. And and for some reason, I made the agreement that, okay, he's taking care of us. He gets to make the final decision. It was very like a 1950s housewife. It wasn't really me. It wasn't my soul. But I was in this, I made the agreement early on, and I had kind of outgrown the agreement. But at the same time, this was our life. And I found that as I got older, my voice and how I felt about things became more and more important. But I never really had the opportunity in our life together to just make the choice and say, this is what it's going to be, and be as stubborn as he was about it. There was always the negotiation, and he'd always win. It was quite frustrating. That said, I missed him more than anything. And that I can't even put into words how the depth of the loss. But I was faced with this power after he died, and this kind of all these choices. And it was overwhelming at first. And then I started to realize this is a really important lesson for me. And I wondered, would I have gotten that lesson had he lived? That occurred to me. Like, would we have stayed the same? Because, he was older than I am. He was 60 when he died. So he was formed, and he wasn't really growing in that way. He was growing in other ways. He was curious about everything, but he wasn't really growing in the way of like, how can I evolve into an equal partner?
Yeah.
So that's an aspect I really have never discussed with anybody publicly, but it's something that for me, like this whole thing has been in part a real lesson in autonomy, a real lesson in how important my opinion and my voice are, and that I'm able to honor them. And now I'm remarried, and I am with someone who is completely respectful of that. And it isn't a negotiation, and it isn't no, it has to be my way. I mean, I'm actually with someone who says, what do you think? Where do you want to go? How do you feel about this? Let's do it your way. And it's kind of amazing.
That's so great that you're you have got this new chapter, this new relationship, but you had, from what I understand, quite a long time in between Chris dying and you meeting your now husband. Is that?
Oh, yes. Yes. I just kind of jumped ahead, but yes, I say that I was in a bad mood for 10 years. I feel like I took my time to grieve this man, and I did have other relationships, but the choices that I made during the 10 years before I met my now husband, Steve, the choices I made were to keep me on pause, to keep me the same so that I could continue my grieving process. I didn't understand that at the time, and I get frustrated with who I was with, that they weren't who I wanted them to be. But the truth is, I chose that person because they were unavailable in some way to keep me the same so that I could heal. I really believe that it takes so much longer if you really let yourself feel. It takes so much longer than you hear to really heal from grief. Not that you ever are done with healing from grief, but to really emerge. And one of the things that accompanied me on this, in the process, was that I always remembered there was joy. I always remembered that there were things so much to be grateful for in my life. Friends, my interests, my art, everything, my writing, I had things to lean on and to support me, and people. And so I felt like, as lonely as it was, I felt I wasn't alone as long as I had my family and my writing and et cetera. And my son was number one, and my son came first. And so there was a pause. One of the reasons why there was a long stretch of maybe one could say delayed healing, was because after Chris died, he became at risk. He was shattered, and I had to put him back together. And that was the most important thing. And he has always been the most important person in my life. And at that age, without a father, he fell apart. And he was a musician from the time he was a little boy. And Chris was also a musician. He was a singer-songwriter. So Chris had taught him, my son Mason, his first chords of guitar. And so that really helped Mason. It was a place for him to go and to take his grief. And I directed him to that. As I might have mentioned to you, I created this committee of men so that he would have a support system. And one of those men was a fabulous guitar teacher who remained his guitar teacher for years. But Mason started to grow, and he started to be able to express his feelings he couldn't express in a conversation with a friend or with a teacher or with family. He was able to articulate what he was feeling in his songs. And that was everything, and continues to be. So he was my project. Grief, I say, like, grief loves a good project. Well, Mason was my everything project, because I had to make sure that he was going to be okay. I felt like when Mason fell apart and lashed out and ran away and all these things that happened, I felt like I had to I knew my grief would still be there. I felt like I had to do everything to make sure he was going to be okay. Otherwise, it was like I lost both of them, that I lost two people.
Yeah. And I know that you have shared with me that you both went to our house, and you got a lot of support from there. So perhaps you could share with the listeners what our house is and how that was for you both.
Okay, yes. Our house is a grief support center. So it's not a place to go and get therapy, but it's a support center. And our house was truly the beginning of our healing. And I didn't want to go. I didn't want to be a widow. That word, I mean, come on. I was just like, I do not want to do this. But I had two friends at the time who were volunteering as group leaders. And I remember they got together, they came over, they got together, and they dialed the number for me. And they actually set up the intake, what they call the intake. And so I didn't even want to talk to them on the phone. And I had this appointment, and Mason had an appointment. We both had our intakes. And it actually was pretty much right away that we had the intakes. But Mason said to me, "I'm not doing this." And I said, "We'll talk about it when the group is ready," when they didn't have a group for us yet. And they also like you to wait a little bit, because you're in what I call the chaos of grief, where you have so many things you're doing to get your life reorganized, and so much emotion and so much shock, which is what we were in for a long time after. But you don't want to just jump into a group. You don't really have anything. I think it's hard to process whatever's coming in. So Mason and I started in July. It was our first night. And he said to me, "I'm not going in." And I said, "You're going in. All I'm asking is you give it one chance. Just go once. If you don't like it, you do not have to go. You do not have to come back." And I said, "And I'm going to do the same." And we both went in the room. And at first I sat there and I was looking around thinking, there's no one in here that I would be friends with. Like, these aren't my people. And, and within, I would say 5 minutes, that's it. 10 minutes at the most, I just melted. I just was like, oh, I found my place. I found my people. Mm-hmm. Everybody's story is the worst story. That group is the great equalizer. Grief, loss is the great equalizer, because we're all the same in it. We're all struggling. We're all sad. And Mason left after the first group ended. We walked out of our rooms and he walked down the hall. I was so worried. And he just went,
Oh.
he said, "I loved it, Mom." And that was it. And his group lasted, at the time, it lasted almost 2 years. And then they later asked him if he would be a teenage leader of a group, because he is articulate and he was able to find this place where he could share his process of what he was going through in a safe way. He did have a great support system of friends, thankfully, but it's different when you're with someone. I mean, just that group is about identification and belonging, which are the two things that you need so much during a loss. I mean, even before you're trying to find meaning again, you just want to feel like you're with people who are going through the same thing and you have a place to belong where people aren't trying to fix you or ignore you.
True. Yeah, I love that, the identification and belonging, and just someone to validate our feelings and make us feel like what we're going through is, has some kind of normality, even though you feel like this is so far from normal. And just being in a group and in a community just is, I think, the most powerful thing.
It really is. It is. I'm so grateful for them. And later on, they asked me to be a group leader for the same group I was in at the time, middle age. And I went through the training to be a grief support group leader, got the certification, and I realized I couldn't be back in the room yet. I just wasn't ready. And they were grateful that I had recognized it but I did. And so I volunteered at our house in other capacities. I volunteered in medical education there, where I would meet with doctors from UCLA and USC in a group, and they would throw questions at me, even though I wasn't in a situation where my husband was in hospitalization or under treatment. They wanted to know if it was okay to say this or that to someone who had just lost a spouse or a child or a parent. Like there was so much fear and so much that was and remains unknown about how you speak with someone who has had a loss. And I feel like I helped facilitate that for them.
That's very, very interesting. Can you think of any things that were said to you that you remember being very triggering by other people?
Yes. Actually, I wish I had that poem in front of me, because I recently wrote a poem about, we had this couple that we were best friends with. And as couples, it's always hard to find that couple that you want to hang out with, that everybody matches well. And we traveled with them and they were just the best. And the woman was one of my dearest friends, and we're not friends anymore. And she was there at the beginning and they were fantastic to us. But as time went on and I was in so much anxiety and disturbance and unease and all the things that one is when one is grieving, and with a full plate. I mean, I'm a mom and she's not a mother. And I think it was really hard for her to understand that it wasn't just about me, and that I was in survival mode. And so I wasn't that person that I was before. And many of my longtime friends were able to make that adjustment and just be there for me, but she wasn't. And she would say things like, I recently wrote this poem about it, as I mentioned, the poem is called "The Healing Meter Has Expired." And it's like it just expired. Like, okay, I'm done helping you heal or watching you heal. And it's, your time is up. And our time was up. She just ghosted me, basically. And it was devastating. It's one of the most painful losses of my life. But again, as time goes on and we view these losses, they change as we change. And I feel like that happened in 2014. So I had 6 years of the relationship going from being really close to drifting, but still being friends, to mourning the loss of that And then now here it is, almost 2022. And I can say that my growth has been, I don't need her if she cannot accept me, because I accept her. I accepted her in all of her changes. And she would say things to me like, I'd say, can you ever just invite me to the movies with you and your husband? Just, like on a Friday or Saturday night, I'd love to just invite me along. And she'd be like, 3 is an awkward number. I mean, she'd say things like that. Or she'd say, I miss the Susan who wrote thank you notes. And she'd say, we're all just waiting for the happy ending to this story. When is that going to happen? Things like that were just not helpful. I mean, you can think those things.
Yeah. You can't say them. No.
So it was devastating. And I think there's this website, I think it's called What's Your Grief? But I saw this chart posted. You okay? Yeah, I saw this chart posted about grief and like the sub traumas of the loss. And it had like 16 different things that can happen after a loss, not just the loss of the person, but all the things. I'm not kidding. I had like 14 out of the 16 happen to me. And one of them is just the loss of others that you love that can't accept who you are now and go with you on this. And friendship, I think, is so much about that, maybe even more than love, than a love relationship or partnership. A friend, you want to know your friends are going to be there no matter what for you.
Yeah, it's a harsh reality when you realize that you don't kind of fit into their boxes anymore.
Right.
Yeah. And it's definitely, a very common thing that happens, particularly with when a bereaved spouse. Thank you so much for sharing that story, because that is personal, but I know that it will be very helpful to many people who are listening to this. I really appreciate that.
I mean, I think I can talk about it now because I've reached a point where it still leaves me breathless. I still, when I think about her, but at the same time, I'm in a place of knowing that I don't want someone in my life who has all these judgments toward me and about me. I mean, I don't expect complete acceptance, but I want the exchange. I want to have the dialogue, and I do want that love and that appreciation and that gratitude for what we share. And that was gone. So.
Well, it makes me come on to what I want to talk about, your work as a writer, because you sound like somebody who's such a good communicator, and you are a writer, and you were saying earlier how creativity, as well as your friends being supportive, having Our House, but your creative outlets were something that really supported you. So
yes.
Share a little more about what happened with your creativity.
Yes. Well, something else that helped save my life at the time was I had been a writer, and I had written a novel, and I had written short stories and poems and plays, been produced as a playwright when I met Chris. I mean, actually, a lot took place while we were together, but I had just produced his one-man show before he died. And it was a sporadic thing. It didn't have a run, but he performed it a handful of times at a local theater in Santa Monica called the Ruskin Group Theater. And the two guys that run it, the owner, John Ruskin, and the managing director, Mike Myers, they were great. And I didn't get to know them very well, but they appreciated, I think, that I would say like that, because I always thought I would die first. I said, put on my tombstone, she knew how to pack a house, because I would always pack the house for Chris when he would do the show. And so we had this kind of camaraderie, I would say. So after, and years before, I had more than 10 years before, maybe 15 years before, when Chris and I first got together, we produced a show together called Gas Food Lodging, which was performance fiction, taking writers, taking novels and short stories and dramatizing them with actors and a director. And what happened was they knew we had done that show and that it was something that we did for a while and it was pretty well received. And so Mikey and John approached me and said, we want you to start your own show. And I was kind of like, what? And they said, we think that would really be helpful for you to have something to look forward to every month. Why don't you do your own show? So I said, okay. And this was about a year, almost 2 years after Chris died. So it was a good time for me because things were settling down a bit. And so I just decided, because I was always a part of the community of writers who would read around town, the spoken word community. I had been someone who was reading every night of the week when I met Chris at different venues. I'm reading from my, what I call story poems. And so I just decided to check in with my community of writers in Los Angeles. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I made a bunch of phone calls and we had a night. And at first I didn't have a name for the show, but I remembered that my son called me Library Girl because the first time that he saw me in my reading glasses, which had been a few years before his dad died, he said, Library Girl, bookworm beauty. And so that always kind of stayed with me. And so I think he was the one that might have said, why don't you call it Library Girl? And so, yeah, I mean, at the time, honestly, I still felt like a girl at 45. Now, I kind of wish I could change the name because I'm definitely more of a lady or a gal than a girl. But anyway, so that first night we launched it and I started doing them every month. So I just had my 12-year anniversary of the show. And what it is it grew. It's something that just grew out of the loneliness of grief. And that was my attempt to find meaning in my life again after the loss. So I created my own sense of belonging by creating my own community, separate from any community I'd had with Chris. And so I have poets, playwrights, sometimes screenwriters, creative nonfiction writers, essayists, and it's all, the evenings are centered around a theme, and the theme is usually a lyric from a song or a song title. So it's steeped in music. And Mason, bless his heart, has been opening the show since he was 12, and he's now 25. And yeah, it's been fabulous. It won an award. I won an award from the city of Santa Monica's, actually not the city of Santa Monica, it's the Santa Monica Arts Commission, and the Brewery of Finkel Award, which was such an honor for, that was a few years back. And then the show it was named like best series on the West Side, best local literary series. It's been something that I just never thought about stopping. It has kept me rooted and anchored. And it has, like, we have like a before hang and an after hang. So there's the show, which is each writer reads 7 minutes. And sometimes it could be, anywhere from like 5 to 15 writers, just depending on the night. And then I also have singer-songwriters. And so sometimes I'll split it between the music and the words. And it just celebrates the written word. And it's been such a blessing for me.
It's amazing. It's a really powerful, process of your grief that you came. Yeah, it's wonderful that they came to you, as well, and suggested it and something that you could look forward to, and then how it's like blossomed and grown. And it kind of feels like it really, how you were saying that when Chris died, you didn't have this autonomy. So it's like probably a very important part of you having this autonomy that you can do things for yourself and create a show. And And how
Yeah.
lovely that you had Mason as well, open it.
Yes. I know. It's been, yeah, he just shows up every month. And I think one month he didn't come after, I mean, out of all these times, because he was in Nepal. He did a community involvement thing 2 years in a row with his school. And they were in Nepal right before the earthquake, like 2 years in a row. And the second time, the earthquake was 2 weeks later, which is crazy because all the sites that he visited were gone. Talk about being present, right? I mean, just that could have happened. And but these trips changed his life in ways I can't describe. But so that was one time that he didn't come, but he's there every month with his guitar. Now he and his partner, Irene Green, they are called the Prickly Pear. They're a duo. So I have them open the show or close the show, depending on it. And sometimes they've written songs for the theme, and they've gotten some of their best songs out of just being inspired by a theme.
I can't wait to visit next time.
You must come and read.
Yeah. Oh, I'd be so nervous reading. I like shake a lot. But
yes, I'm the same, but it's a really supportive audience. And I think you'd be nervous at first, but then you would just take a breath and you'd realize everyone was excited to hear what you had to say. And it's the best audience. It's such a loyal audience. Mm-hmm. And during the pandemic, they closed the theater, obviously, for a year and a half. And I didn't know what I was going to do, because even though I have this new life with a new husband and it's an amazing life, the show is also such a huge part of what fills me. And so I moved it online, and I didn't do it as a Zoom. I did it as individual posts from writers, but I still had the container of the theme. So the first one I did, I collaborated with a colleague of mine, Daryl Larson. We had a show planned that we were going to present in March of 2020 called Steps Must Be Gentle, the poetry of Tennessee Williams. And we ended up we originally had like 10, 12 people on the lineup, and we didn't know what was going on with this pandemic. We just didn't know what was happening. It was that first month or two, we just kept extending it and getting more tapes. And we had about 45 participants altogether. Cool. Yeah. And I did these shows almost every month until we were back in the theater, which was this last August.
Oh, fantastic. So fantastic. Now, Susan, do you have something you'd like to read of yours to share?
Certainly. I have a piece that I wrote that was published in a wonderful online arts journal called Tribe LA a few years back. It's called Souvenirs and Evidence. Mm. The search and rescue crew handed me the bag like a forgotten sandwich. I held it for days, a Ziploc of belongings, his taxi wallet, damp from melted snow, with 12 crisp $100 bills, weekend cash to pay for my 45th birthday. His red bandana covered in rocks and ice, smelling of sweat and torn mountain skin. Our son's 5th grade picture in his wallet, hazel eyes, pirate t-shirt, gypsy hair, face staring back at me with that I am safe look. And then the goggles, still foggy, still defrosting from a long night and buried. I held the bag for days. It was the last of him. Later, when people came to pay their respects, to tell me how he was in a better place, he died doing what he loved, only the ache remained, like heart surgery without anesthesia. I would share the bag and its contents with anyone who was interested. A friend put her arm around me and said, "You don't have to worry anymore. All the things you were afraid of have already happened to you."
Goodness, Susan, thank you so much. Gosh, that really encapsulates, I think, everything we've just talked about.
Everything, just about. Wow. Yeah, that does include some of those statements that people can make. I think everyone means well. You know, that's the thing. It's like we just want to fill that space instead of what we learn in grief, hold the space. People just want to fill that space up, whether it's us with ourselves, just filling ourselves so that we don't, almost like it makes us not feel. And then people try to fill that space so you won't feel your pain, you know?
It's so very true. And I think that's what we're really understanding more and more about grief, that you're not to be afraid to sit in the pain. And we are coming to my final question, sadly, because I feel like I could sit here and talk to you for much longer. I like to ask people, what your interpretation of the term conscious grief would be?
Well, you've answered it just before. My interpretation of conscious grief is not running from grief, sitting in your feelings, staying, being still, allowing yourself to feel. And yes, so that's the first step. But it's also an understanding. Conscious grief is an understanding that there is always joy around you and things to be grateful for. And it's really important when you're in your darkest, the dark night of the soul, to remember, this might sound really cliche, but to remember what your blessings are, to remember what's beautiful in your life, recognize the light, go to the light, and not just think about. Yes, feel and think and know how sad you are and give it time, but also save room for the joy.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's just been a real joy to meet you, and thank you for sharing everything.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I mentioned this to you earlier, and I must say it again. You're doing a tremendous service by providing these interviews for anyone who's had a loss. And I would have done anything to have them those first few years. But I'm still learning and I'm still growing. And every interview I've watched of yours, I'm learning more about this process we call grief. And I love the idea of conscious grief. So you're not just in the void, but you have the awareness to stop and recognize what's happening and make choices that are healthy for yourself.
Beautifully said. Thank you. And thank you very much to everybody who's been watching, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.